Since his election in 2017, President Emmanuel Macron has tried to distance himself from established and widely criticized patterns of France's Africa policy. He diversified relations with Africa in regional and substantive terms, integrated non-state actors, and cultivated a comparatively open approach to France's problematic past on the continent. However, Macron's efforts to craft a narrative of change was overshadowed by path dependency, above all the continuation of the military engagement in the Sahel and incoherent relations with autocratic governments. The involuntary military withdrawal, first from Mali, 2022, from Burkina Faso, 2023, and finally from Niger, announced for late 2023, marks a historic turning point in Franco-African relations. The question is no longer whether relations between France and its former colonies will change. The real question is whether Paris will be able to shape this change, or if it will be a mere bystander to a transformation that is largely driven by African actors. When he became president, Emmanuel Macron was undoubtedly aware of France's reputation problem in Africa. His response was to make a clearly recognizable effort in crafting a new narrative to demonstrate his political will for changing relations with France's former colonies in Africa. The target audience of Macron's message of change and renewal are the African publics and civil society actors who, in the eyes of the president, stand for Africa's positive dynamics. Entrepreneurs, intellectuals, youths, artists, but also members of the diaspora. Macron wants to use these actors as bridge builders to establish new partnerships and leave the undesirable aspects of France's reputation in Africa behind. Emblematic of this method was the new format of the traditional Africa-France Summit, held in Montpellier in October 2021. Contrary to diplomatic traditions, no African government representatives were invited, but only non-state and civil society actors. It remains questionable, however, to what extent this carefully selected circle of civil society figures represents broader societal currents in Africa, or whether it is able to exert political influence at home. In addition to his public diplomacy activities, Macron has also engaged a number of substantive political and economic issues. Continuity in the Sahel and the turning point Mali. In the Sahel, Macron did not appear as a reformer, but merely as the administrator of an inherited and ultimately failed military intervention, which was the largest foreign deployment since the Algerian War. From a West African perspective, he simply continued France's traditional policy of intervention, the public policy narrative of change. Since at least 2019, Macron had toyed with the idea of refashioning or reducing the scale of France's military involvement in the Sahel. But ultimately, no decision was taken to that effect. In the end, it was the military juntas of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger that forced his hand. Macron's in a famous dictum, "There is no longer a French Africa policy," which he coined in Burkina Faso of all places, Ouagadougou, 28th of November 2017, and wanted to be understood as an obituary for the murky Françafrique, not only missed its mark. His claim seemed absurd, given that 4,500 French troops were stationed in the Sahel at that moment. As a matter of fact, Macron's statement, which he has repeated since, seriously backfired. In the Sahel, it was perceived as further evidence of the insincerity of France's policy, which constantly claimed change, but never turned words into deeds. Perhaps unfairly, the lack of success of Operation Barkhane, visible in the steady spread of insecurity and violence, further discredited France's presence in the region. Macron's adherence to a Sahel policy so obviously doomed to failure is to a large extent explained by structural conditions. To begin with, many regional and international partners have traditionally expected Paris to lead security policy in West Africa, while others accepted it more or less grudgingly. Inadvertently or not, This attitude of partners has reinforced France's self-perception as a natural leader in the region. Related to the foregoing is the fact that Africa remains an important projection of French power and grandeur. Historically, the military has played an important role in this regard thanks to its operational expertise, its bases in the region, Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire, Djibouti, Senegal, and Chad, and dozens of interventions since 1960. Going against the diminishing French appetite for military interference since the late 1990s. The decade-long military interventions in Mali and the Sahel have greatly reinvigorated the influence of the military and the Ministry of Defense on the Élysées' foreign policy decisions, to the detriment of the Foreign Ministry, despite the substantive knowledge and skills of its staff. This partly explains the lack of political strategic anchoring of the military interventions, as well as a rather large number of political misjudgments, such as contradictory positioning vis-à-vis the military regimes in Mali and Chad, the failure to grasp political dynamics in Mali, and, for a long time, the rampant anti-French sentiment in the region. In retrospect, the decision to gamble everything on the cooperation with Niger after the Mali fiasco must also be seen as a mistake, albeit one in which France was not alone. Prospects after the Mali debacle. It is hardly surprising that an assessment of Macron's Africa policy so far is mixed and contradictory. On the plus side, there are some initiatives that are beginning to breathe life into the narrative of political change. The politics of memory, aid reform, a less military-centric approach. On the other hand, he extended the doomed Sahel intervention, which, under his watch, resulted in a fiasco. It is paradoxical that the reformer Macron did not know how to break through path dependencies, although there is much to suggest that he had recognized the need for a change of policy. It remains questionable how adaptive Paris will be in view of the disaster. Since the withdrawal from Mali, the situation for France has deteriorated further, with severe setbacks occurring in Burkina Faso and Niger. The announced new approach in the Sahel and the region remains vague. The most concrete announcement has been the withdrawal of several hundred troops from bases in Africa, while the transformation of extant military bases into some form of joint training academies remains ill-defined. Certainly some mistakes have been recognized and a number of conclusions drawn. These include the pledge to take the needs of African partners more seriously, rather than trying to define them on their behalf. There is also the intention to act more discreetly, and thus to be politically less vulnerable. More of the same. They were also counterproductive, as they diverted attention from the coup plotters and instead contributed to closing domestic political ranks in Niger against France, the common enemy. Other steps, such as the suspension of visas for artists and students from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger for security reasons, are politically self-defeating. Also unhelpful is Macron's tendency to underestimate the historical depth of the animosity to France's policy in West Africa, construing it as the result of political and communicative manipulations by strategic competitors, Russia, China, Turkey, or local demagogues. Mali will go down in the history of Franco-African relations as a political turning point. The crisis has exposed the weaknesses of France's Africa policy, such as the contradictory treatment of authoritarian rulers, ineffective military approaches, and, too often, unrelenting paternalism. For Africa's young generations, France and Europe are destinations with diminishing appeal and soft power. Fewer and fewer young Africans associate them with the promise of upward social mobility. For members of urban protest movements, France represents the focal point of their critiques and emancipatory discourse. These groups are changing the domestic political balance of power and putting pressure on African governments that are caricatured by populist spokespersons as France's accomplices. In Africa, France has long since become the object of domestic political contestation and mobilization efforts. There is hardly any other point on which political and civil society actors in the region are more likely to agree than a critical stance towards France. There is no other postulate from which political capital can be made more quickly than the one that France must be put in its place. Paris will suffer a significant loss of influence in the region, no matter what measures the government takes in the short or medium term. Paris could be dealing with a permanently shaken self-understanding of its own role in Africa for years to come and faces the historic challenge of defining a new course towards Africa. For Germany and other European governments, this could provide an opportunity for entering into a policy dialogue with France that is not determined a priori by the superiority of political insights in Paris and the primacy of French interests in Africa. There is no lack of challenges. The manifold consequences of the Ukraine war, as well as climate, energy, and migration policy, are among them, in addition to dealing with Europe's colonial past in Africa. Reforming aid. The Macron administration has also initiated a modernization of its development cooperation. Among other things, official development assistance, ODA, is to be increased and used more effectively. After almost a decade of stagnating or declining spending on aid, the multi-year development policy financial planning of August 2021 provided for an initial gradual increase in ODA to 0.55% of GDP and to 0.7% by 2025. The government also plans to change its priorities. After years of increasing the share of ODA received by emerging economies, the least developed countries are to obtain greater support starting in 2024. In 2021, the latter group was given 16.3% of France's gross bilateral ODA, much lower than the average of 22.9% that other members of the OECD provide. The share of grants in bilateral aid is to be increased to 70% by 2025. The main recipients are to be a group of priority countries and low-income countries, mostly in Africa. Discrepancies persist, however. Officially, 18 African countries, plus Haiti, make up the list of France's priority countries, but none is among France's top 10 ODA recipients. At the same time, France's ODA focus on Africa is somewhat relative. In 2021, 36.8% of its aid went to Africa, 4.7 BN, but roughly 40% of this was obtained by just 5 countries: Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, South Africa, Tunisia, and Egypt. However, in August 2023, the government announced the suppression of its priority list of partner countries, and it remains unclear whether a new list based on revised criteria will be drafted. Paris is also striving for stronger political steering of development cooperation at the strategic level. An interministerial, National Council for Development, and International Solidarity, CNDSI, is to set out the broad political guidelines. On the ground, French ambassadors are to take on this role in partner countries. These centralization measures are accompanied by an increase in the bilateral aid share from 57% 2015 to an average of 65%. In addition, as of 1st of January 2022, France's technical cooperation agency, Expertise France, was integrated into the Agence Française de Développement, AFD, in order to bundle competences in the implementation of aid projects and create more coherence. Overall, the changes seem to point in the right direction. French aid has a reputation for being politically arbitrary and lacking effectiveness. Over the last decade, the discrepancy had been growing between declared political priorities and the allocation of aid. Africa's share of ODA, for example, had declined from 52% 2010 to 41% 2016. Sub-Saharan Africa received only 29% of French ODA in 2016. Of this, only 10% went to the 5 states of the Sahel, although the region had been a foreign policy priority of the French government since 2013.